Hello, my name is Dr. Eric Landrum from the Department of Psychology at Boise State University, and you're watching my screencast for my research method students about survey design. And this is actually a very relevant topic for us because typically when I teach the research methods course, this is the methodology that I focus on the most. Not to say that between and within groups designs aren't interesting and important, they truly are. But I focus on this topic because I think, regardless of your career path, whether you're going to graduate school or trying to get a good job with your bachelor's degree, survey research skills can actually serve you in a number of different domains. And so that's why I tend to focus on this a little bit more than other types of research designs and methodologies. And so you can see a pretty formal definition there on the screen. I think it's kind of nice because it kind of outlines the steps where, you think about what do you want to know when the survey is complete. You identify a population, you sample folks from that population, you analyze results, and you generate a report. And, to be honest with you, that follows quite nicely with the steps of the scientific method and actually the sections of a psychological journal article with the introduction, method, results, and discussion. And so really the survey is just like any other research method, the entire representation of the scientific cycle of generating new knowledge. So, a couple key questions to start with. I want to do a little bit of framing with this, and then we'll get into some very specific detailed examples about survey design, selecting scales, things like that. But generally speaking, what do you want to know when the survey is complete? This is really important for students and clients and consultants to understand. A lot of times the idea comes up, hey, let's do a survey, which may be all well and good, but I think you have to back the train up and ask the question, what do you want to know when the survey is complete? You can actually do surveys that could end up doing a great deal of harm to a cause or an organization. So they really need to be thought out, just like any other type of research design. And clearly, that second bullet, sometimes the way you ask the question will actually influence the answers that you get. And so we want to be scientists and scientific about it. We want to be as objective as we humanly can be. And so we want to ask questions in which the answers can either support or refute our null hypothesis or our working hypothesis. And so we want to be very careful with this because if we're not, systematic or unsystematic bias can actually creep in and then taint the results. And I've got some examples that I pulled from the literature. So here's a great example of a survey question that you might be interested in. Abortion is a private matter that should be left to the woman to decide without government intervention. And so if you are asking this on a survey, it's kind of interesting. There's a bunch of things here. So part of it is about a private matter, woman to decide, and then without government intervention. And so one of the interesting things that the researchers did is they had people, men and women interviewed, and sometimes the interviewer was a man, sometimes the interviewer was a woman. So think about that dynamic here, and you can see the pattern of results. And so this is the percentage who agree with that statement above. And so when men were interviewed by a man, 70% agreed that abortion is a private matter. But when a man interviewed a woman, 64%. So you see the effect here. And so this isn't even about necessarily in this survey design the question being asked, but who was asking the question. And so even the gender of the interviewer might make a difference in the outcome of the results to the survey question. And so, if you're doing that kind of one-on-one research design, or you're doing this thing where you're standing at the corner and you're asking people as they walk by, you have to be careful about the context and things that might influence the way people answer survey questions. Here's another one. Would you say that traffic contributes more or less to air pollution in industry? Now, part of the issue with this is it's a little bit convoluted, and so the comparison is not clear. So when you ask this is actually real data. When you ask that question the way it's stated, would you say that traffic contributes more or less to air pollution in industry? 45% will say traffic contributes more. 32% will say industry contributes more. Oops, let me go back. And the rest would say that there's no difference. Okay, so notice that. Now, Another set of people, very similar to the first set, were asked this question: would you say that industry contributes more or less to air pollution than traffic? And notice the only thing that's changed in the wording is that traffic and industry have switched positions in the sentence, in the question. And so now look what happens. Traffic contributes more, 24%. Industry contributes more, 57%. So notice the pattern here in this kind of a convoluted question where you've got to kind of hold on to the thread to get to the idea. What happens here, this is called an order effect. And so the one that came first is the one that got beat up on, so to speak. And so when industry came first, 57% said industry contributes more. But let me flip back. When traffic came first, 45% said traffic contributes more. And so now we're unclear about, which one contributes more. And now we've got this other factor, this confound about order. And so we might have to change the wording, or we might have to make sure that we ask all the possible orders and then analyze for that and make sure that there's not an order effect, as there clearly is here in this study. Here's another example, and I like this one too. If we were to ask the question, what's the most important thing for children to prepare them for life? All right. And you can kind of see where we're going here, where I'm trying to give you examples of how you ask the question might influence the answers that you get. So in one version of this study, the participants were actually given a list, like you could imagine this long checklist of items, and you check off the one that you think is the most important. And when presented with a list of alternatives, 61.5% chose to think for themselves. That makes perfectly good sense. However, if you actually ask people in an open-ended format, that qualitative format where they're filling in the blank, what do you think is the most important thing to prepare themselves for life? Only 4.6% will answer something related to think for themselves when there's not a list presented. And so here's a great example of closed-ended versus open-ended. And I'll circle back to this at the end of the screencast and talk a little bit more about that. You can see it really makes a big difference in this case. And this is the kind of thing where if I were doing a research study on a topic, of importance, I might look at both methodologies to make sure I've got some convergence, and try different angles, different pursuits to make sure that I've got a really good grip on the actual outcomes and what they really mean. Here's another example. This is going to be a little bit about scaling. So how successful have you been in life? And we can ask one group of participants on a scale of -5 to +5, and they would pick one of those points along the scale. And in this study, 34, just over a third, reported a perfect score of a +5. So how successful have you been in life? A +5. If you ask that on a 0 to 10 scale, only 13% are going to report a 10. And I think part of this is because this, even though the scale has 11 points in both cases, and go ahead and count it out if you need to, from -5 to +5 includes a 0, so there's 11 scale points, and 0 to 10 includes a 0. That means there's 11 scale points. We don't typically think of ourselves as a 10. That actually has some connotations as perfection. But I think it's easier to associate, well, I'm a 5. And be perfect, as opposed to I'm a 10 and I'm perfect. And so again, even the scaling, 11-point scales, but the way the question is couched and framed might make a difference in how people respond. And that's a pretty dramatic difference between 34% reporting the top end of the scale versus 13% reporting the top end of the scale. This is kind of a really cool study. It was done a while back, but they were asking folks, it was actually in Germany, about their daily TV consumption. And I want you to notice the left hand versus the right hand frame. It's really interesting. So if you look at the left hand frame, when you start with the low increments up to a half hour to an hour, and now go to the darker line towards the middle of the screen there. So 16.2% report that they watch more than 2.5 hours when it's asked that way. What does that mean? Let's do the math. That means that 83.8% said they watch 2.5 hours or less. Well, now switch it over. If you start with up to 2.5 hours, only 62.5%. So on the left side, it was 83.8, but on the right side it's 62.5. And then look at what happens. So even where you start the scale, even though there were 6 increments there on both sides of that left and right frame, you can see the context, the anchoring can make a difference in the amount of time people are reporting that they watch television. So, and I think this is kind of a nice example because it's got so many multiple problems in it. And so, if you were to ask this question, it is wrong for female patrons in bars to swear and buy drinks for men who are unknown to them. Well, there's really about 4 or 5 questions in there. It's about wrong for female patrons and bars. Is it to swear and buy drinks? What if I swear and not buy a drink? Or what if I don't swear and buy a drink for men, but what about if I buy a drink for a woman who are unknown to them versus known? That survey question is a mess, and people will answer it, but you're really going to be unsure of what it really means and how to interpret it. Not only is it double barreled, it's probably triple or quadruple barreled. And what I mean by that is that you're asking more than one question in the question. And that's going to seem kind of straightforward, and it's kind of seem like one of those duh, but you want each survey question to ask about one thing and only one thing. And so if you want to ask about swearing, ask about swearing, ask about buying drinks, ask about that in a separate question. Don't put them together. And here's the tip off for me when you look at and. So if you were to ask someone, I enjoy going to Boise State football and basketball games. That's a double-barreled question because if I enjoy one but not the other, how do I answer? And so it'd be better to separate that out into 2 separate questions if you really want to get at how people enjoy those events. This is actually kind of just a screenshot of a handout you're going to get from me. And so you can see that double barreled there at the top. Double negatives, you want to avoid using certain words that are going to be, implicitly negative. Again, we want a fair test of the hypothesis. We want to be able to either support or refute our working hypothesis. You want to avoid bias, be concrete, try to avoid too many, acronyms. You want to ask people questions that they actually have the information or opinion to not to answer either correctly or with an informed opinion. So again, you can come back to this. You can freeze the screen, come back and look at it. And if you're in the course, you're actually going to get this as a handout. Sometimes we ask questions with pictures, and so it might be this is about a taste test, and so you would check the box that best indicates your perception, your opinion about the topic, about the item that you just tasted or smelled. Sometimes you'll see this one in hospitals, a pain scale. You may have a patient that actually can't speak or has difficulty speaking. And so they could point to the picture or they could try to relate this. And by the way, there's a version of this with children. It's called Chernoff faces. And so you can have these faces that have different levels of expression. And then hopefully those relate to the underlying constructs about, in this case, it would be about pain. I like this scale. It's called a semantic differential scale. There are usually 7 underscores there, and you pick somewhere along a continuum. So fair to unfair, good to bad, helpful to not helpful. And so that gives a person a chance to express a level of magnitude or amplitude about whatever they're being asked the context. It could be about that parking experience. It could be about sporting events. It could be about satisfaction with a course or an instructor, for example. I like this one as well. This is a good one, a visual analog scale. This is actually a screenshot from Qualtrics. And so you can ask, and actually you can see that I grabbed this from some real survey. Workplace categories, move the slider. 0 means completely dissatisfied. 100 means completely satisfied. You can see you're asking there, in this case, 6 different questions. And on the screen, what happens is the person clicks on the arrow and they can drag and drop and indicate their level of satisfaction or dissatisfaction. This is again another screenshot of a handout that you're going to get from me during the course. Most students tend to stick to an agreement scale or frequency scale. And there's many different variations on this. You can ask about importance or evaluation, usability, dichotomous yes-no scale. You can see some sample demographics there. And so there are a lot of different varieties of types of scales. Now, I will say this, and we'll get into it later in the semester, is that the type of scale that you select will impact a little bit about the hypotheses that you can test, but moreover, the statistical analyses that you conduct to test your hypotheses. And so this is not a lackadaisical decision. It's an important decision because you want your survey design to be just complicated enough to get the answers, and then that's it. In other words, we don't want to complicate it more on top of what we need to. We want it to be as simple as possible, but yet answer our hypothesized questions of interest. Some advantages of the survey method: you can do this with anonymity and confidentiality if you set it up that way, whether paper and pencil or online. You actually, with a sufficiently large number of participants, you can apply some very meaningful inferential statistical techniques where you can, get p-values and test your null hypothesis, calculate effect sizes, and so on. The U.S. Census is a great example of this. In 1790, some of the same core questions on the U.S. Census from there is asked every 10 years in the United States. And so if you ask the same questions over time, you actually have a chance to compare some societal and cultural changes over time. And so there can be some benefits of that technique as well. They can be relatively cost effective, although not always. If you're doing that in-person interviewing, that can be quite expensive. However, if you're doing a mailed survey or an online survey, it could be relatively low cost, depending on who you're asking and the techniques that you're using to gather the data. You can have some control over sampling. And so rather than relying on that randomness, you could oversample. So let's say, for instance, that you know that 80% of nurses in the practicing field are female, and you want to do a national survey of nurses. You could make sure in your survey design that 80% of your ultimate sample are females, so that sample represents the population. And so we can actually ensure representativeness with different sampling techniques. And you can read about those in the textbook. I'm not going to go into them here too much. Some disadvantages, just to be honest, about the survey approach, the survey method. You really have little control over variables of interest. And so we're really not manipulating or controlling variables here. At best, we're probably arranging our independent variables. And so you really, although you can do true experiments with survey designs, typically that's not the case unless you're trying to figure out the factors that do influence survey responses. And so sometimes it's kind of, you get what you get, and you don't have a lot of control over random assignments, so to speak. Return rates can be a problem. So if you're doing a mailed survey, if you're doing an email request and it's an online survey, we get these a lot in the email inbox and the Twitter feed on Facebook. And so we have to worry about return rates a little bit, because if I send out a national survey and 6% of the people respond, I'm going to have a hard time drawing the inference that my 6% respondents are representative of the entire sample or population, especially when 94% of those participants fail to return my survey. And so return rates can be a problem, and so response rates. And so we have to be careful about that in survey research. Oftentimes, you have to be careful about that those returning the surveys may not be representative, especially if you get that low response rate. And so sometimes you see this with end of course evaluations. And so you get this request to evaluate your instructor in your course at the end of the semester. And sometimes, I'm not saying this is always the case, but sometimes those students with an axe to grind are the ones that make sure they fill out their survey or their course evaluation, whereas the ones who are very satisfied with the course may or may not fill it out. And so if people are volunteering because they've got an axe to grind or a story to tell, that could be problematic, especially when we get those survey results and we want to draw conclusions, broad-based generalizations based on that data. We want to be careful about that. You have to be careful with socially desirable responding, or that inaccuracy due to lying. That really occurs with sensitive topics. And so, you really can't have a room full of 100 people and say, okay, I want you to raise your hand if you're a racist. It may very well be that people are racist, and quite honestly, I think all of us are probably racist in some small way or another. Sometimes it's larger than just small, but I think everyone has some element of racism or racist thoughts at some point. Yes, including me. And but it would be very awkward in a room full of 100 people. Yeah, I'm a racist. You don't usually raise your hand to something like that. And so if you're asking about really sensitive topics, and gosh, these days it might be domestic violence, it might be abortion, it might be stem cell research, you can fill in the blank here of what's a hot button topic in today's society. If you want to ask questions about that, that might be a very relevant survey topic, but you have to be careful and make sure that they're couched in a way that I can actually express my opinion without looking negative. And so, getting back to the racism, I may not come out and use the word racism in my survey, but I might try to appropriately tiptoe around the word. And so I might ask questions like, sometimes I treat people differently based on what they look like or based on where they're from. And so you're centering in on it, but you're not actually coming out and using that word that will probably just turn people off and say, no, I'm not a racist. With the survey method, whether it's in person or like a bubble sheet or paper survey or even online, something that's incorrect, you've got to reject that. And so there are errors. People make errors. So there are sources of inaccuracy that we'll get to here in a minute. So if someone says, they bubble in something incorrectly and you ask for age and they say they're 123, odds are they're probably not 123. Or if you ask them other questions and it's just the chances of that being accurate are astronomical, then you have to toss that data out because you can't include that. Otherwise, you're going to draw some inappropriate conclusions based on outlier data. So that's a disadvantage of the survey method. I mentioned this just a moment ago, and so just to kind of circle back to it. So when folks are answering survey questions, there are multiple sources of potential inaccuracy. And so you might be asking questions where respondents don't know. And here's the thing, we don't like to look stupid, and so sometimes people will just fill it out rather than leaving it blank or just marking an I don't know response. And so you might be asking a survey question about how many credits does it take to graduate, and someone might just guess if they don't actually know. Respondents cannot recall it, although they know it. And you've probably had this experience before. Remember reading a textbook and then you were taking a test later on in that course, and you're in that test and you remember, oh my gosh, that was on the left-hand side. It was in the margin on the left-hand side of the page. Oh my gosh. So you remember reading it, but you really can't recall it. You can't generate that from your memory. That could be a source of inaccuracy. So you know it, but you can't really recall it at the time. It could very well be that respondents do not understand the question. This is going to be especially challenging for folks whose first language is not English. It could also be for depending on the age range or education range. And so, really, one of the goals when I'm working on my own survey design, when I'm working with students with survey design, one of the goals is shoot for an eighth grade reading level. And you might think that's kind of low, but if you shoot for an eighth grade reading level, most college students ought to be able to read that fairly well. And finally, respondents do not want to report the answer in the interview context, and sometimes this happens with sensitive issues. So if you're asking a survey question about how many times per month do you have sexual intercourse, I might know the answer to that, but I don't want to respond to it on a survey, even if I believe the survey is anonymous and confidential. And so sometimes you might get a lower number, they may leave it blank, even though they know the answer. In that context, they don't feel comfortable in providing that information. This is a nice little graphic from DFink that talks about open-ended versus closed-ended. And this is kind of the thing that you might want to save. You can come back and freeze the screen and look at this more carefully. I don't want to read these to you, but really it talks about purpose, the respondents, how you're going to ask the question, how you're going to analyze results, how you're going to report them. And so I think if you read through this, you can see the benefit of both approaches. And really, open-ended versus closed-ended is very much akin to qualitative and quantitative. And so we can benefit from looking at both types of data. It doesn't have to be an either or scenario. Even though most psychologists tend to focus on the quantitative, we can learn a lot from qualitative data. You can see that if you read that column there, it says, if yes, use open. And so I would encourage you, down the road, outside of the course, when you're doing consulting, you're going off to graduate school as part of your job with your bachelor's degree, to think about both techniques because there can be some richness and meaningfulness to both of these. So I think it's fair to talk about when it might be good to not use a survey. And so, for instance, when there's a little bit of hysteria around a topic, maybe it's a historical landmark and there's a debate about it, or maybe it's the closing of a clinic or the opening of a clinic in a neighborhood. Sometimes a survey might actually be adding fuel to the fire. That second bullet I think is so important because organizations might be curious about something, but once they get the results, they're not committed to do anything. And so I think there is sometimes an implicit kind of agreement between the survey administrators and the survey takers that the information can be taken seriously. And so I think that that's an important consideration. If you're going to, that third bullet is kind of interesting because sometimes really marketing and advertising are framed in the context of a survey, of a scientific survey. And it may very well be that you're trying to get product placement or someone to think about your product, and you're really not interested in their survey responses at all. Well, from a scientific perspective, that's deceptive, and obviously I'm going to discourage you from using those deceptive practices. And finally, if something is incredibly complicated and it's very complex, surveying people about their opinions about it may not really get you what you want. I mean, surveys are good for a snapshot. A great deal of psychological research relies on surveys, but if it's a really complex situation with multiple interactions and factors that influence it, a survey might be one approach, but perhaps it shouldn't be the approach to how you look at that. So that those complex situations probably require that multi-method, multimodal approach where you can study a topic from different perspectives, and hopefully they kind of triangulate and coagulate into one unified conclusion about what you're studying. All right, that's it for me for survey design. This is for Psych 321 Research Methods.